Welcome in. We're going to be learning about value. So for value, there's a lot of different things we can say about it, but we'll be focusing in on it in a 2D way. So thinking about differences of light to dark. So we're moving on our elements of design. We're now on to our third one, almost halfway through. We're thinking about how we want to define it as the relative lightness or darkness of a surface. So how light or dark something is. The word relative is very significant because we might have something that we think of as being light gray, and depending on what's around it, it will look lighter or darker than it does next to something else. So if you have a light gray next to a medium gray, it's not going to look all that light to us because the value is pretty close to what's around. If we have a light gray next to a black, it's going to look very, very bright because there's a big difference between those, even though it's the same light gray that we started with. So we'll be talking more about that relativity as we go along here. But thinking about how the lightness or darkness of a shape is largely determined by its surroundings. So the surroundings of something very much impact how that light or dark we think it is, what the value looks like for us. It's only through changes of light and dark that we can actually perceive anything visually, which is pretty astounding, actually, if you start to think about it. Thinking about how if we didn't have a difference of light or dark in anything, if everything was the same value, we actually wouldn't be able to see any of the things that we see. So color has value to it. Achromatic, meaning things that are white or black or gray, those all have value as well. So if we didn't have the value of something, we actually wouldn't have any distinction, be able to tell one thing from another. When I say achromatic, I'm talking about things that go from white to black. With this change up, this movement of white to black, we have a lot of different grays in between. We call these achromatic. Achromatic means that there's no color. So achromatic, no color. We also have this representation of our grays, so thinking about going in segments. In this one, it's a really smooth transition that we're going from the white to the black. So this one here, we have that smooth transition. We would call this a gradient scale. This one we would call a step scale. So we have these incremental sections that go up. It's even transitions from the white of the screen to a light gray, medium gray, dark gray, and black here. So looking at other shifts in value here, we have it in a circle for us. We also have it in a grid for us too. This is an image of a piece from a past color theory class, but thinking about if we're trying to create achromatic grays, we have a middle gray here going through the middle. Our lightest light is always going to be white. Our darkest dark is always going to be black. So when we're thinking about a full range of value, we go all the way from a white all the way to a black with a kind of 50% in between being that mid-tone gray that we have here in the middle. We're talking about value contrast. Whenever you hear the word contrast, I want you to think of difference. So we're talking about the different values. We think about this in relationship between the areas of dark and light. So there's high contrast or high difference if we have a big difference in value. So you're like white and a black next to each other. We would have low contrast or low difference of value. We have something like a light gray next to a medium gray. So here's some of our achromatic grays. In the middle of each of these is actually going to be the same gray. So this little square is the same gray as this one. This little square is the same gray as this one. So depending on the surroundings and depending on your screen that you're looking at this right now, it's all very relative. If you're looking at this on a projector, in person, or on your own individual device, all of the values, and when we get to color eventually, color is going to be the most relative medium in art, but value is also very relative depending on what surroundings are. When you hear these words together, a value pattern, all that it means is the arrangement or the amount of variation between things that are light and dark in the composition. So with this, we're looking at basically the placement of where the light and dark happens in the overall composition. So for instance, in this piece here, if we turn it into this achromatic black and white scene, we can see this value pattern that we have values that are really close together here in the trees and the sky, a little bit more variation here in the figures. Then we come up here to the left, there's this high contrast, high difference between our light lights and our dark darks. What this starts to tell us, and if we can think about back to our emphasis lecture, is that this is the emphasis of the painting. This is the focal point. We have the biggest contrast in this area because we have that really big difference in value for us. So if we want to have an area of the painting that our viewer's eye is going to go to first, we want to have that high contrast. Value is a great way to get that. If you want something to look like it's further off in the distance, or maybe not catch the viewer's eye right away, having low contrast is a good strategy to do that. So how do we create value when we're creating a drawing? So this is going to be something that we're going to be practicing in this class from here on out that you can integrate into a lot of our exercises and assignments. But some of the main ways that you're going to create value is through these methods called hatching, cross-hatching, and stippling. There are other methods as well too, but we're going to be focusing in on these three. So this top one here is what we call hatching. Hatching are going to be straight lines next to each other. And by having these lines next to each other, the closer they are and the more lines you have, the darker it looks. The less lines and the more space in between, the lighter it looks. So here we have on the left, we have lots of lines that are straight right next to each other, and they're creating a darker value. If we pan over to the right here, we just have a few lines, they're spaced out, creating a lighter value for us. Cross-hatching is really a build on from hatching itself. We still have straight lines, and depending on the amount of lines is how light or dark something looks, but we get the cross part because it's actually through layering. So hatching is going to be lines going in one direction. Cross hatching is when we not only have lines going in one direction, but then we have another layer going on top going in different directions. So still straight lines, but instead of maybe being vertical lines, maybe they're going to be horizontal lines that are crossing over. Cross-hatching is my favorite way to create value because you can have a lot of control with it, and you can be really effective with it. I also like it and want to stress that when you're doing cross-hatching the proper way, you're using very light pressure. The beauty of that is that then you can do what we call reductive drawing, which is going to be reducing the amount of, let's say, that you're using graphite. You could use your erasers to lift off some of the graphite that was there on the page, reducing the amount of graphite, reducing the value that was there so you get back to some lighter values. So that's really great because then when you're drawing, a lot of times you want to be open to going darker or lighter in different areas. So if you're digging into the page with hard pressure, adding value, that's going to make it where you can't go back later and lift off or refine or lighten something. So doing a crosshatch method where it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of patience too, but you'll build up layer upon layer, working in a different direction with your straight lines as you go. And with that, you'll have very controlled value that's developing, and you have the ability to go back in if you want with your erasers to do reductive drawing to get back to those lighter values or clean things up as you want to. So cross-hatching, very important, a skill to know and technique to know. And then stippling is our third one that we're going to be talking a lot about. So stippling, same idea still, that the proximity of the mark creates or reduces the value. This time, though, it's going to be dots. So if you had a pen or pencil, you'd be just like stamping it down onto the page multiple times. The further apart those dots are, the lighter the value, the closer they are, and you're building them up, the darker the value becomes. Okay, so just another example of hatching and cross-hatching, also showing it in stages here. So number one here on the top left, we don't have any value on it. It's just a contour line drawing of a circle. Number two, we have hatching. We just have lines going one direction. Three, we have cross-hatching because we have the layer of the next set of lines going across our first hatch lines. Number four is also cross-hatching, same with five and six. It's just that each one has more and more layers going in a different direction. And with that, starting to build up the value, showing us that there's this form and dimension to this sphere. So it's not no longer a flat circle, it actually has form to it for us. So over here on the left are more formal definitions of hatching, cross-hatching. And these are also going to be stippling, hatching, cross-hatching, but I also want to talk about a couple others that we might not be focusing on this class, but it's good to be aware of them. This one in the top middle is called scumbling. Basically, it's scribbles with the same technique or idea that if we have these scribbles really tight and close together and they're building up on top of one another, we have dark values we can create. If we have less of the scribbles, we have more space between, less layers, it's going to be a lighter value. So not as much control, not as defined or refined as cross-hatching can become. The one on the bottom right here, this is going to be blending or smudging. You can create an effect like this by adding friction to value that you've created. So you technically could start with hatching, stippling, scumbling, cross-hatching, any of these methods you could start with. And then you would go in, oftentimes people use their hand or their finger. Sometimes sometimes you can use other things like a tortillon is a tool that we use in drawing. It's actually just paper that's like wound up on itself. You could use Q-tips. My favorite is using what's called a powder puff. It's actually like old school, like to apply makeup that you would use, but it's really soft. And with that, you can get a really soft blending effect. So basically, if you have graphite or charcoal is even better down on your page, you would then be adding friction. So that could be with your finger, it could be the powder puff, and you'd be moving it around on the surface on top of the value built up. And it's going to smooth out or blend that value together to create that smooth transition. Now, blending and smudging is something that a lot of beginner artists will overdo. They'll jump into smudging or blending too early. For instance, when I teach drawing classes, I don't allow my students to blend or smudge until they get to the end of their drawings. The reason that I do that is similar to the philosophy I have with cross hatching, is that we want to work with really light pressure so that we have the option to go back into our drawings and remove things as well. If you start off with blending and smudging too early, with that friction, you're working your graphite or charcoal into the paper and it's really embedding it into the fibers of the page. It's going to make it really hard and sometimes impossible to be able to go back in and correct anything or reduce the value that's there. So if you go back into erase, but everything's really ground into the paper, then you're not going to be able to remove whatever it is, if it's graphite, charcoal, that is stuck into the paper there. So blending and smudging can be great to have as like a final effect, but you would want to wait till later to apply it. You also want to make sure to not overdo it, because when we were learning about these elements of art, one of them is texture. There's going to be things that we want to have like a rough, more raw texture to them. And if we blend everything, it's all going to look the same. We're not going to have that variety. We're not going to have that effect of roughness if we're smoothing everything out. So that's another thing, is not to go too heavy into blending or smudging where everything starts to have this shiny quality, because visually that might not be what we're trying to achieve in a drawing. So thinking about not over blending and making it so you got your options open in the end as well. Another note is that our fingers are going to be the most accessible or easy tool to use to blend or smudge. But the reason that we have other tools that we might want to use instead is that we all have natural oils on our hands and our fingers. If those natural oils get onto the page, several things can happen that can make things go not how we want them to. So one thing that could happen is, again, with rubbing things into the page with that friction and blending. If we have those oils in the combo there, that can very much make it where it's very difficult to change anything around and you have lack of control. Another part too is that those oils can sometimes cause resist. So let's say you blend it and you realize it's not dark enough, so you want to go over it with a couple more layers to make it darker. Sometimes with those oils, it creates almost like this waxy or resist and of course oily kind of surface. So there's no more of our pigment or our charcoal or our graphite that will go on the page because there's like this sheen or layer in between. So there's definitely ways to avoid that. One of the easiest is to make sure your hands are clean. Make sure you wash them and they're thoroughly dry right before you use your hands to blend. The other one, of course, is to use something other than your hand to smudge. So tortillons could be an option for that, a powder puff, a Q-tip, whatever it might be, that don't have those oils on it in the beginning. So moving on here, thinking about this application, if we're going to combine, maybe it's someone that's crosshatched and then they've done some blending, we can have a little bit smoother, but it's still kind of raw. We still have some texture in here too, so they didn't overblend it. But we see here this application of a value scale. So this value scale that we have down here, it's going to be a value scale because it's moving from our lightest light to our darkest dark. So it's showing us this full range with these nice in-between grays that go up in increments for us. So it's a step scale for us. It's going even increments along the way from light to dark. And we see them applied here in this top image. So we have the sphere here, we have the lightest light here, and we have it moving across into what we call a core shadow. That's going to be the darkest part on an object. And down here, we have this little glow that's reflected light coming back onto the object. So with this being the lightest part on the top right, that means our light source is coming from the top right as well. And if our light source is coming from the top right, coming down here, I'm going to actually annotate on here so we can see a couple more things. If we have this light source coming from the top right, we could think about how if the light source is in this one ray coming down, It's going to be very predictable for where our core shadow is going to be. So going in between these red lines that I just created, this is basically like the direction of the light coming down from the top right. And because of that, we're going to be having the shadow going down into the left of the object on the surface it's resting on. So our lightest part of the object is going to be receiving the light. So that's here on the top right because it's facing the light source. And then because it's a sphere and has form and mass and volume to it, at its wider part, it is receiving and then turning away from the light. So it's getting blocked by the light. And that blocked part becomes our core shadow. It's the darkest part of value on the object itself because it's not receiving any light directly from our light source, and it's not receiving any light from the surrounding area. The reason we get this little glow back here is because from the surrounding area here, we see it's a lighter surface. It's actually bouncing back or reflecting back onto the surface. So we call this little reflected light band here. So reflected light right here. And then this part below is what we call a cast shadow. A cast shadow is going to be darkest closest to the object because that's the part that's blocking the most light. As it moves away from the object, it starts to get a little bit lighter because it has a little bit more of that ambient or environmental light that's starting to diffuse it. We also have the edge of the cast shadow that's going to be crispest, at its most crisp. There we go. That's how we can say that. So it's going to be a more defined edge closer to the object because of it being blocked more severely there. As it moves out, again, it has more of the ambient light, so we get that softer edge to it as it gets more diffused with the rest of the shadow there. So light logic, as soon as you know kind of the rules with it, becomes very predictable for us, especially when there's a single light source. Okay, moving on here. So thinking about a value scale, we have that full range going from our lightest light to our darkest dark. If you're looking at splitting up that value to not have that full range, you could have what we call low key. So low key are going to be our dark values. So like our mid gray to our full black, which we have here on the right part of the scale. High key, on the other hand, is going to be our lightest light of white all the way to our mid gray. So it's going to be the lighter part of our value scale. And then we have what we call the middle key, which is going to be really that range of grays in between for us. We can think about and help to kind of identify what's low key or high key. Think about high key as being like an emotion or attitude. So thinking about like being up key or being happy, things that are going to be light and optimistic as high key. So light and optimistic, like our light values. You think about low key as being maybe you're down. So thinking about we have these kind of like gloomer, darker, more negative values going into those dark values. We can also talk about contrast. We can talk about contrast being the difference between things. So if you have low contrast, there is not going to be that much of a difference between our values like we have here. Typically, as a viewer and for art pieces, those are going to be seen as being more calm or peaceful compositions. Whereas if we have high contrast, meaning a big difference of lights and darks, usually there's more drama and excitement that a viewer will see and feel when they're looking at a composition with high contrast. Okay, so also going just back to like a little bit of a review, some other terminology we can think about with value. We have hatching, those similar direction lines to create value. We also have cross hatching, where they're going over each other, creating those layers. We have tonal, where we're going to be doing basically the shading or the blending to create things to look smoother. We have stipple, scumble, and then smudge again there at the bottom. Tonal and smudging, honestly, are very similar to each other. Smudging, you just have a little bit more of that friction to make it look a little smoother. So here we have this piece created with cross hatching. There's no blending or smudging. So we have all that nice open texture in it. This one here, we have more of our hatching, a little bit of cross hatching and some contour line. And here we have more blending. It's very soft. We have more of these diffused edges. And here is more going to be digital for us, but thinking about this pixelation that can be created, but how through the value we start to have the form of a figure. And I want to talk about too some techniques or applications of value. Some of these are rather historic, going back in time. So a lot of the European masters would use this one called chiaroscuro. It's the artistic device of using light and dark to imply depth and volume in a painting or drawing. So application of all these techniques that we've been learning about with value. So thinking about if we have this light to dark, we can start to understand the spatial proximity or quality that something has. So it's what is closest to us or furthest away. It starts to show us a sense of space, essentially, and also a place of emphasis or focal point in a drawing. So here on the bottom half, we have this piece that's really just created with line, looks a lot flatter. And then the top half, we have this application of value. So with that, we start to see this form of where the roundness is, what's closest to us, or moving away into shadow. We can also use what's called atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective is going to be huge for us because it's one of the most effective ways to show what's closest to us and what's furthest away. So usually far off objects are going to be looking less distinct, more generalized, also have low contrast. Things that are closer to us are going to have higher amount of detail and higher contrast. So bigger differences between our lights and our darks. In doing this, we'll suggest distance. So we have in this piece here, we have these more contrasted pieces that are closest to us and have more detail on them. In the back, our values are much closer together. They're also more generalized on what information is given to us as viewers too. And with this last slide, I show an example of atmospheric perspective. This concludes our lecture on value. There's a lot more we could say, but I'm sure this is already enough of a takeaway for you for today. But we'll be applying a lot of these techniques along the way throughout our semester.